Thanks for joining Talks at Google. Today we are talking to Stephen Lacey, a veteran cleantech journalist and editor, and a leading industry storyteller about the intersection of energy, climate change, and business. Stephen is responsible for some of the cleantech industry's most popular journalism and commentary, both through his work as editor-in-chief of Greentech Media and as co-creator of the podcasts The Energy Gang and the Interchange, which are both in the top 1% of all podcasts today. Stephen has mastered the art of audio storytelling, and recently I was lucky enough to work with him to create a 6-episode podcast miniseries called Where the Internet Lives, which explores the unseen world of data centers and the people who operate the physical infrastructure that power the internet. Today, Stephen is the founder and CEO of Postscript Audio, a production firm that creates world-class podcasts with a focus on climate and sustainability. We'll be talking to Stephen about cleantech journalism, how to be a great podcaster, and how audio storytelling can be a uniquely powerful tool to mobilize people around climate change. Stephen, thanks for joining us.
Hey, Barry, so glad to be here. Thanks.
So I've just given my introduction about your work, but it would be great if you could introduce yourself and describe where you've been in your career and what you're most excited to be working on today.
Yeah, so I've been at the intersection of two pretty important trends over the last decade and a half. One is the evolution of climate tech solutions, the interest in solving climate change, and how the business world has been grappling with the changes in energy markets and the rise of clean energy. So I've been following that since the dawn of the modern renewable energy, clean energy era. And I've also been mostly reporting on it both through print but in audio, and have been producing podcasts for the last decade and a half and have seen that world evolve considerably and seen how you can really build communities and disseminate information in unique ways through audio on these topics.
So the clean energy and climate change space has undergone massive changes and ups and downs in the past 15 years, and that's what you've been focusing on. Can you summarize some of the most meaningful and remarkable trends that you've observed over that time?
Literally everything has changed. If you just look at costs alone, we've seen a 90% drop in the cost of solar in just the last decade, an over 80% drop in the cost of wind, more than 75% cost drop in batteries. We've seen every major utility now sign on to a net zero goal, recognizing that their generation mix is increasingly going to be renewable. We've seen trillions and trillions of dollars from the world's investment banks go into climate solutions and now going out of fossil fuels. And back in 2006, when I first started reporting on this, renewable energy was certainly coming into its own, but it was not a sure bet at all. It was very unclear where the path would take us. And I think the rise of clean energy, renewable energy, has surpassed most expectations. But with that said, it hasn't really touched people's day-to-day lives in a major way. So many of the extraordinary technological changes that we've seen and changes to business models have been happening behind the scenes. And people who have been focused on energy have seen how these things have changed. And I think only now are people starting to get a sense of how this is going to impact their lives. And so that's the next stage where I feel like these changes will be a lot more present in the way that we go about our ordinary lives.
And how has reporting itself on these topics changed in the past 15 years? The underlying trends and technology changes are one thing, but what about how journalists cover the stories, the tone, the angles they're taking, and so on?
On the energy side, I think people are now really starting to take energy technologies and the broad suite of climate tech solutions across industry and agriculture and the electric grid very seriously. And when I started reporting on this field, it was very clear that there was this steady march of progress, but most mainstream journalistic outlets weren't really taking it seriously. And the vast majority of energy reporting was on oil and gas, in particular, the rise of gas and whether renewable energy would be more than a bit player. And now you see a lot of mainstream publications that realize that this shift is happening very swift, and you just see a lot of folks taking it much more seriously, and therefore large reporting organizations staff up around both climate change and the changes in the energy system. When it comes to climate change, people have just taken it way more seriously, and you've seen a lot of scientific journals start to call it a climate emergency, which is a pretty big deal when you have a lot of scientific publications coming together saying we're no longer going to call it climate change, we're going to call it a climate emergency. That's a pretty major shift in tone from, just a decade ago. And I think that urgency is starting to make its way through most publications.
So last year, you and I worked together to produce a Google podcast called Where the Internet Lives, which is about the warehouse scale computing facilities that power everything on the internet, from Google search to YouTube to all the other websites um, people are using. What were the most interesting things you learned about data centers during that project, and how do they tie into your world of clean tech?
There were so many cool things about data centers that we learned. And that project was obviously to say there's this world of data centers that almost nobody gets to see, including most Googlers. So we're going to open that world up to you and show you the inner workings of how these massive warehouse sized computers actually work, how they're networked together, and how they power the clean energy economy. So the thing that really I think relevant to this conversation, the thing that wowed me was how you can start to change compute loads to match demand on the grid, and to match supply of renewable energy. And we did an entire episode about how you start to think about the interaction between data centers running compute loads and what kind of energy mix you have in a certain region. And that is opening up a whole new world to actually pairing uh, renewable electrons with bits and bytes. And it's really interesting to see how that is actually happening today and will soon be passed to data centers all around the world. The other piece was just how vast the networking is. We did some on, we mostly focused on what was happening inside of data centers, but we also looked at how these data centers are being networked together, and understanding the complexity of that network and how resilient it is, um, was also quite eye-opening for me.
So climate change, the clean tech economy, and energy policy are all central to Google's goal of operating on 24/7 carbon-free energy by 2030. And there's a large cross-section of people at Google working directly or indirectly on achieving this goal. As someone who's been in this field for a long time, what advice or warnings or insights would you share with these folks at Google who are working on this, about the scale of the challenge?
I think the main insight when it comes to large corporate players is that most of the people working on these issues inside of companies like Google and other tech firms recognize that this challenge is not about installing a couple large solar systems or buying credits to offset electricity use and saying that you're 100% powered by renewable energy, that it is going to take investment in technologies that maybe don't exist. It is going to be partnering with lots of different companies across the field to help deploy solutions that are not in place today. It's going to be investing in carbon extraction and sequestration methods. Some companies are looking at this, not just planting trees or buying offsets, but actually figuring out how do you invest in carbon sequestration. And then certainly something that Google and many other large players are doing, just buying historic amounts of renewable electricity, like literally market shifting amounts of renewable electricity to power operations. And so the scale of this moves its way down into every part of the business. And historically, when I first started in this space, you started to see the corporate sustainability model unfold, but many companies would hire a corporate sustainability officer, and that person would really have no influence on the chief financial officer or the CEO, and there would be their mission was very siloed. And today I think that's changed considerably. That the people at the top recognize that you need board expertise when it comes to climate. You need people in the C-suite who have a passion for it and an understanding of the climate issue, and that needs to work its way down through every decision that a company is making. And while it's complicated and we're certainly far away from solving the challenge, I really do believe that like most of the big companies out there recognize that that's what needs to be done and are starting to put the pieces in place to make it happen.
I want to move to storytelling as a theme here, and specifically the storytelling you've done on climate and energy. In your career and your current work, what have you found is the most effective tone or approach to take when communicating with the public about solving climate change? Do facts work? Does fear work? Do you want to inspire people in the right way? What do people respond to? And what do you try to focus on?
There is a lot of research on what people do respond to, both related to just like any kind of scientific topic and related to climate change specifically. And people respond in very similar ways. The more facts you present them, very often, the more they dig into their pre-existing beliefs, the more myths are reinforced. And very often, a lot of science communication and science journalism will reinforce the myths, and then they will present the myth up front and then try to categorize facts to convince someone that is untrue, and what they're doing is just playing into that person's already existing belief, or people are overwhelmed by facts. So we decided that that is just not the best way to present stories. And as we're building out our network of climate shows, what we're thinking is you have to meet people where they are. When it's a business show, for example, you need to be able to talk about how this is actually making people money, how you can actually implement this into your company. What are the very specific things that the energy transition, how can the energy transition specifically benefit your company, or how is it evolving the world of business? If you talk about climate change in a cultural context and meet people where they are when it comes to housing, or how people are moving around the country or making choices about their housing, when it comes to popular culture, and like bringing these stories into the ways that people are interacting with celebrities and celebrity culture and social media. There are lots of ways to talk about the climate challenge without hitting them over the head with scientific facts. And there's a huge number of people who actually care about this stuff. So there's a study put together by the Yale Center on Climate Communication, and they showed that there are about 12% of Americans that are alarmed about climate change, but there's another 54% who are what we call the climate curious category. And these are people who are concerned about climate change or cautious about climate change. They know it's a problem, but maybe they think it's a little farther out. They're not as worried about it, or they are worried about it, but they're not sure what they're supposed to do about it, and they can feel really overwhelmed with the options. And so there's a real opportunity to meet those people where they're at culturally. And that's our philosophy. And that's how we found that stories really work. It's all about telling stories where people are.
So, in addition to your career as a climate and energy journalist, you've been podcasting since 2006, probably before I had heard of a podcast. And in a recent interview, uh, I even heard you were called the Podfather when you were a mere 21 years of age. What first drew you to the medium of podcasting? And was there a moment when you thought, wow, this thing creates new possibilities?
Yes, and now in podcasting, it's become extraordinarily cliche to say it's an intimate medium, right? But when you hear someone's voice in your ears week after week, you form a really deep relationship with that person, what are commonly called parasocial relationships. And the audio medium does that particularly well. So when I was young and in my early 20s and starting out podcasting on this thing, we had a show that nobody else was doing a show on the business of clean tech, and we put together this show that was the only thing that existed in that at that time, and people flocked to it, and we gathered a pretty significant audience at that time. And in a very short period of time, I was meeting people at conferences and events who treated me like some kind of niche celebrity, which totally took me by surprise, but that was purely a function of the medium. Like they felt like they had a relationship with me. And this is something that is common with all the shows that I listen to. I feel like I'm in a relationship with the host. And so it showed me that there's something special with podcasting that can help you tell stories in a deeper way. And when you attract people to your show, they'll stay with you. They'll listen to what you say. And if you maintain your credibility and treat the audience with respect, they are with you. And it's going to take a lot for them to drop off.
You've covered a huge range of topics in your career, from politically charged subjects to highly technical ones. Is there something you look for when you first approach a story, regardless of what it's about? How do you make uh, the stories you tell both compelling and accessible to a large audience?
Yeah, this is a challenge that we've had to grapple with for a long time because I've done a lot of B2B journalism and B2C journalism, and the stories, and that's business to business journalism and business to consumer journalism. And the stories are often very different. In the business to business world, you have to be able to explain something very clearly and try not to get swept up in jargon. But the stories are often very straightforward. This thing happened. It can explain a particular trend happening in the world that is related to something that you do or that your company does. And the parameters around choosing stories are pretty straightforward. When you start to broaden that and have to explain complicated subjects to people who are interested in the subject but are more general interest, you really have to be careful about getting rid of jargon, about tapping into the why of stories in a much deeper way. What is this thing? Why does this thing matter to universal experiences, to universal questions that we're asking, to some bigger thing that people might have heard about in the business world or in the broader cultural world? And so you have to be able to move out into those different layers to give someone a lot more context. And we always use extremely simple language as well. So you have to be able to explain the concept of why something matters to a fifth grader. When we're pitching stories, you have to have a very, very clear, simple explanation that someone can get almost immediately. So I think there's always a challenge with explaining complicated subjects to a wider audience, but that's exactly what we've been set up to do in the podcasting world, and we're going to continue to do. So this is a complicated story. Climate change is the most complicated story of our time. It challenges the way we see the world. It's very hard for human beings to plan long term. We're constantly fixated on the things that are in front of us, and climate change is inherently a collective problem that requires us to work on a generational timescale very quickly, and that is extremely hard for human beings to do. So to be able to tell that story and make it relevant to people's lives is the challenge that I've been working toward for my entire career.
And why do you believe that audio storytelling in particular is a powerful medium to tell stories about climate and energy challenges and climate and energy solutions?
It goes back to what I said before, and that is like the parasocial relationships. When you have a host who has established her or his credibility, you can tell stories that do not feel heavy-handed, and you can, I think, provide a lot of context that you may not be able to get in other mediums. Now, if you think about film or or any kind of video, you can do really powerful things by showing people the scope of the problem. I think you can recreate many of the same conversations in a streaming video as you can in in an audio only podcast. But film is really good for showing people the scope of a problem. Print journalism is particularly well suited for investigative journalism and for shaping really deep detail. Audio is extremely good at um, uh, making someone feel very close to and attached to a story. And so I think that makes the information more trustworthy and digestible. So that's why I think it's got its particular uh, unique benefits in this world.
So let's move on to the the podcasting industry and audio storytelling as a field. Podcasts are extremely popular right now in the U.S. The latest numbers are that 57% of the population over age 12 have listened to a podcast before, compared to 2006 when only 11% of Americans had listened to a podcast. And in 2021, more than 40% of Americans have listened to a podcast in the last month. What explains the meteoric rise in the popularity of podcasts?
Well, I can say that there's also a common joke in the podcast world that it's nice to be able to go back to your family and explain what you do and they understand it, because back in
Mm-hmm.
2006 and then, even up until recently, a lot of people hadn't even heard the term podcasting, so you'd have to kind of break out your phone, explain explain what it was. But now, I mean, I think it's a technological access issue. First of all, look, Android phones and iPhones are loaded with the Google Podcast app and the Apple Podcast app. People just have more accessibility to podcasts. So you have a massive number of smartphone users who already have access to podcasts right now. I think the people stream everything now. So the streaming culture has really, and the idea of on-demand audio being so ubiquitous has really opened people up to podcasts as another piece of that ecosystem. And audiobooks and courses are quite popular. And so because spoken word audio and music streaming has become so popular, podcasts have just found their natural place in that. Uh, Also, you just have so many celebrities and media companies who've developed shows because they've realized that you can form these deep personal relationships. You can tell stories in new ways without having to invest in, a massive in without having to invest in a massive film crew. You can tell a documentary story or an ongoing story with much less money, but the same kind of intimacy. And so these media companies are now, and celebrities are now throwing so many marketing dollars behind these shows. It's more likely that you're going to bump into them on social media or wherever you are on the internet. And so those factors are coming together to make podcasts much more popular. And then when it comes to just consumption habits, people are finding that they can listen to audio wherever they are. And because it's so easy to get it on your phone now, you can just do it everywhere. And so podcasts are creeping in on our music consumption. And in 2020, even though we saw a drop in podcasts for listening for a little while because people's commutes got cut short, all of a sudden we saw that creep up. And we actually saw an increase in podcast listening last year as people found new ways to integrate spoken word audio into their lives.
I also saw some statistics that there are now more than 2 million podcasts, but something like 1/3 of those have published fewer than 3 episodes, which is pretty remarkable. It's like people have these dreams of having the next big podcast, and then they can't get past episode 3. So does this mean, I mean, what does that statistic suggest to you? Is that people start podcasting but find it difficult to sustain? And does that make your heart sink? Or what advice would you give to folks who want to start podcasting and keep doing it well for the long term?
Yeah. So I think you're exactly right. It can be hard to stick to. So the vast majority of shows people are launching, and I mean, we saw a record number of podcasts in 2020 as people were stuck at home trying to recreate the conversations they were having, trying to find an outlet. And so we saw a lot of new podcasts launched in last year during the pandemic, but the vast majority of them are not making it past a few episodes. So that that does not make my heart sink, because I still love the democratic nature of this medium, and it's still very easy for a lot of people to create shows, and the technology is so accessible. I love that, but it means that it's really hard to break through. So you have to be really consistent, and it's not easy. Most people show up thinking, I'm going to buy a microphone, and because I have great conversations with my friend, I'm going to recreate those conversations. But the vast majority of really good shows out there have an extraordinary amount of planning involved, even for a one-on-one conversation. There's a lot of thought that goes into it, and that means that it's very resource intensive, and it can be a lot to maintain over time. Now, that's not to say that people can't show up and have really good conversations and break through, but it's very difficult. So what does that mean for someone like me who has a company that is creating shows that need to break through? It just means that you have to throw more marketing dollars behind those shows. In the climate and energy world, for example, when I started out, we were the only show focused on this. And for years, we were one of the only shows. And one of the shows that I recently launched, 6 or 7 years ago, was still, it was at a time when there were still very few energy and climate shows. And so we were a first mover, and we had a huge audience benefit to that. But now we have to throw a lot more dollars behind shows to make them successful. And ultimately, I think it's still possible to rise to the top, but it takes a lot of consistency and certainly a lot more marketing dollars.
When we made the Where the Internet Lives podcast together, you taught me some excellent tips for recording audio and making it sound good, which included constructing a pillow fort a few times a week in my bedroom, which is easier said than done. But what are some simple things that folks in the audience can do to improve their radio voice? Is technology and gear as important as the story you're telling in a podcast, or where should people allocate their attention when creating their show?
I was a little disappointed you weren't doing this from your pillow fort today.
I do have a floral pillow right here. I do have a slightly different arrangement, but there are pillows involved.
There are two answers to the question. One is finding your voice, and the other is, does technology matter? And how do you create the best environment for good sound? First of all, I think bootlegged sound is fine. You can do a lot with your surroundings to make something sound really good. There was a there were a lot of Twitter threads when COVID hit of famous radio people who had turned their homes into studios. And there was a picture of Ira Glass, for example, in his closet, surrounded by suits, barefoot, scrunched up in a computer, using a nice mic on his laptop. And most people were driven into their closets. And you know what? The closet is a perfectly fine place to record. In fact, I am here in a converted closet myself. I have foam all around me, but this is just a closet that I borrowed from the house, and it's the perfect place to be. And so I think a lot of people will have those small spaces where they can get really solid audio, and you shouldn't feel like you need some fancy studio to get decent sound quality. Um, so there's a lot you can do with pillows and blankets and a little bit of inexpensive foam from Amazon in a small space. When it comes to finding your voice, actually, when it comes to technology, I would say that there are a lot of decent mid-range USB mics that people are using. But if you're going to invest something, you can get, a small USB interface and a really decent shotgun microphone for a pretty good price and really expand your audio quality. And that's something that we worked on with you, for example. And like, it wasn't a very big investment, and the difference is
Right.
extraordinary. So, um, so there are a lot of options in kind of the mid cost range. In terms of finding your voice, I mean, it takes a lot of practice. You have to be prepared to listen to yourself over and over, and it's really uncomfortable. It took me 4 or 5 years to really find what I thought my voice was, and my voice, in audio is very different from my personality day to day. I'm kind of, if I'm at an 8 or a 9 in my day to day, I'm up at a 10 or 11 when I'm talking behind the microphone, and, and you have to kind of find a rhythm in the way you're delivering narration, and that just takes repetition and practice over and over and over again. And that goes back to my earlier point, which is a lot of people think they can show up, buy some microphones, have a really good show. And that does work for some people, but there's usually a lot of practice that goes in to find whatever it is your narrator voice or your personality is. And that can often be overlooked.
So could you tell us a little bit about your company, Postscript Audio, and what your roadmap is to create a network of climate, energy, sustainability themed podcast, and how it will all come together ideally?
So yes, so we were launched Postscript Audio a couple years ago, and we were mostly production for hire. We were developing shows for different kinds of media outlets and companies, and we have since leaned into the idea that climate is an everything story, and we need to create more shows that are relevant in news and politics, popular culture, food and travel, uh, DIYism, um, like people who are mechanically minded, real estate, society and culture. There are any number of shows that can really support an implicit or explicit climate theme. And so we're currently working on building out the network to establish a bunch of shows that fit into those really popular categories. And again, are not heavy-handed, are not trying to lecture people, but are making people think differently about um, environmental issues and climate change. So we have started with a stable of shows, and we're currently kind of reformatting the company and building out the network itself. And then we'll be investing a lot into original programming. So we have two popular business shows that are in the top 1% of all podcasts, that are kind of more B2B shows, but they're highly popular in that world. One is the Interchange, which is kind of like Bill Simmons meets Ezra Klein for climate and energy wonks, and the other is called the Energy Gang, which is three well-known experts who we follow kind of the political gabfest model, the model that's common in a lot of different shows to dissect the most popular trends in climate and clean tech right now. We have a show called What It Takes, which actually Google sponsored, which is an entrepreneurship show about the people who are building the climate tech economy. And these are the people who are toiling day in and day out, building startups for anything from carbon capture tech to new software to control the grid to new mobility startups. And we're developing that in collaboration with Powerhouse. And there are just so many extraordinary entrepreneurship stories in this field. And having been in this for a long time, I know that there's a lot of people in the broader business and tech world who are looking to get into the climate tech space. And so these stories are really act as inspiration for them as well. We're also developing a series for Columbia University called The Big Switch, and it is a mini series that we'll be doing a few times a year that focuses on how to decarbonize different sectors of the economy. And it's doing it for a general interest audience. So this is not like a real deep how-to manual for practitioners. We're taking a step back and saying, here's this thing that's really important in our lives. For example, the electric grid. Um, what are the changes that are happening right now? How do we accelerate those changes so that we improve reliability, make it cost effective for everybody, and help address climate change? And we're doing that for for all the different major sectors, for transportation, for industry, for the electric grid, and providing a roadmap for literally how do we get it done. And then we have plans for some of these other broader cultural shows that I mentioned. And over the next year or two, we're really going to expand this network to somewhere in the range of 7 to 10 shows. And we just feel like the opportunity is right there in front of us because, as we all know, climate change is literally an everything story. It is not just a science story. It is not just an energy story. It is a story that it is now influencing all areas of our lives. And we can build shows around that.
I'm excited to tune into all of them. Uh, quick question about the business of podcasting. You need to sustain these shows and these stories. On podcasts, I hear a lot of ads for new types of underwear and electric toothbrushes, and I've purchased several of those things. But are ads like that the crux of the podcast business? How does the business side work? How are you going to remain a viable producer?
Yeah, the ad model is definitely the most popular. So the podcast ad industry is about $1 billion. It'll surpass $1 billion in 2021. Most shows are supported by ads, or at least most of the big shows. But they're also supported by ancillary revenue, whether that be Patreon campaigns or paid for content through, bonus podcasts or newsletters. So there are more, I think, just like any other journalistic outlets, everyone's trying to diversify their revenue around subscriptions. With that said, ads are still fundamental to the business. And I frankly have no problem with ads. In our experience, because we've focused on companies and organizations and economic development agencies that are focused on climate solutions, that there's a really good relationship between advertisers and our audience. And we have virtually no negative feedback about the kinds of ads that we run. And so going forward, we really need to curate an ad experience that is only for companies that are taking climate change seriously. And that may open up, it may end up being um, not just energy or industry companies. It could be a much wider swath of companies, but we feel really comfortable with the idea of an ad supported model, but we also have to be really careful about the kinds of advertising relationships that we're developing. So I think that will continue to be important for everybody going forward. With that said, because your audiences generally care so deeply about the hosts or the organizations that are creating these shows, I think that there's an opportunity for, listener revenue, and certainly live shows when we're all back to normal, whenever that is, and people are actually holding live events and conferences. Podcast live events are so much fun, and they have historically been a big part of some of the bigger shows out there in terms of their revenue and their relationship with the audience. And I think that will be a big factor when, next year in 2022.
I'll ask you one more question, then we'll turn to questions from the audience. What has been your kind of most fascinating interview in your career for a person you've spoken with on one of your shows that reshaped the way that you look at climate, energy, and sustainability? What's a particularly memorable interview?
There have been a lot of good ones, and one that stands out recently was Van Jones, who we featured on What It Takes. That was a conversation between Emily Kirsch, the host of What It Takes, and Van Jones. And I had followed Van's career from 2005, 2006, when he started to emerge as an evangelist for green jobs. And he kind of lit the industry on fire. He was just so good at articulating the need for the green jobs movement and how to make the expansion of clean energy more equitable. And then he was hired to be the colloquial the I think that the colloquialism was the green job czar. He was hired to be the green job czar, and he was immediately attacked for some of his previous stances. Like he had some back in his early years, he had like been he had been like a socialist and had been involved in the socialist movement, and he was attacked on television and railroaded out of the Obama administration, and that was a really distressing time for him. And he is obviously now a famous CNN host and author, and his career has built back. But we told the story of that early rise and then what happened during his fall during the Obama years, and then how he rose back up. And he was so open and told a side of history in the clean energy movement that I don't think had ever been told before. And it was one of the more eye-opening stories that I've ever captured on tape. And I really admired his ability to be vulnerable. And that's what you want in a guest. You want them to be as vulnerable as possible.
Sounds awesome. Well, I appreciate you being vulnerable in this interview, and we will move to audience questions now. What is your view on nuclear power, both fusion and fission?
Well, I think everybody realizes that nuclear power is going to have to play a role going forward, and it's unclear what that is going to look like. It's very hard to build current generations of nuclear reactors on time and on budget. And while China is doing its best to build out a lot of light water reactors and sort of first generation nuclear power plants, it's unclear whether we can actually build them in the United States, for example. So the nuclear industry has struggled because renewable energy is just a lot faster and cheaper to build. But it's very clear that we need to keep as much nuclear energy on the grid as possible. That means extending licenses for nuclear power plants going forward. It means investing in next generation nuclear power, like small modular reactors. And I know that the Department of Energy is taking that very seriously, and so are nuclear regulators, and helping try to scale and test those reactors. But I think it's an uncertain future, just purely because of costs and time scale. But most people, even traditional environmental groups who have been resistant to nuclear power, understand that it's going to play a role. And the question is it just keeping nuclear power plants open for a longer period of time to get the benefit of their zero carbon power? Or are we actually going to invest in new tech? And I don't think that we really know the answer to that yet.
Next up, from Molly, recognizing that greening our lives has limited impact at an individual level, what is the number one thing you'd recommend everyday people can do to help fight climate change?
Oh, I love this question because the answer has evolved considerably. And up until recently, I think most people would say, bring reusable bags or recycle more, or try not to take that drive and instead ride on your bicycle, maybe buy some carbon offsets for your airplane ride. And there was this belief that somehow individual behavior changes would solve the climate problem. And of course, we should do everything in our lives to prove that we care about the problem. But in the aggregate, it doesn't really add up to much. What we're talking about are deep structural changes across the economy that can happen and can actually save us money and be really good for public health, but they don't happen without pretty major political change. And so if people are looking to actually make an impact, rather than just focus on sorting your recyclables or making sure you're not using plastic bags, try to give money to an environmental organization or get involved on the local level, in for if there are state legislatures or state regulators that are considering policies that can either enable or inhibit renewable energy. There's a lot that goes on that's very accessible on the local level that people can get involved in. And um, while while we've had mixed success on the federal level, a lot of climate policy is actually being enacted in federal regulatory agencies, in public utility commissions, in and state legislatures, and these can all be influenced by residents of a particular area. So I think being more informed about your ability to play a role in that local process is much more important than any individual behavior change that is, been considered part of traditional environmentalism.
Mhm. What do you think are the reasons that people and or politicians deny that climate change exists?
Well, the wild thing about this is that not that many people deny that climate change exists anymore. And in fact, the research has shown that Americans in particular way underestimate how much other Americans care about climate change. So the Yale Center on Climate Communication has documented the number of Americans who actually care about climate change and the number of Americans who think people care about climate change. And there's a double-digit percentage point gap. And so I think that there's this perception that this small minority of people who are really vocal on the internet are driving a much bigger number of people who deny that climate change exists. And um, it influences the way people perceive other people think about the problem. And so the short answer is I actually don't think that many people are deny that climate change exists. There's also this Yale Six Americas report that I referenced earlier in this conversation. And if you total the number of people who are alarmed, concerned, or cautiously concerned about climate change, you're looking at like 66% of the country. So that's significant. But for the people who do deny that climate change exists, I mean, there are a lot of factors that go in. One is just psychologically speaking, it can be hard to wrap our heads around a long term problem when we're concerned about short term issues. And ultimately, I think it comes back to in the political realm, large entrenched fossil fuel interests who've spent a lot of money convincing people that we don't need to change, or if we need to change, we need to do it incrementally. And that has gripped our political system and it's worked its way down through the way people talk about this stuff. And I believe that is starting to change as more people wake up to the urgency of climate change. But ultimately, I think in the political system, it comes back to money and incumbency.
What can we do to our personal digital footprint to alleviate climate change?
I am not convinced that our digital footprints are really that much of a problem, but I
This
would
kind of
say if
relates
you
back to our
yeah,
Where
but
the
it's a good
Internet Lives podcast.
that's exactly right. So we profiled this trend in Where the Internet Lives, and we talked to a researcher who is a former Stanford professor and a former researcher at the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab who looked into in the 90s whether the internet was going to make energy use explode? And then ultimately, would that be a climate problem? And what they found was projections around the internet's electricity use were just way overblown, and data centers got wildly more efficient. And the servers inside data centers just got better, far better than anyone expected. And ultimately now, what data centers make up 2% of the US electricity use, I think is what it is. And people thought it was going to make up like 10, 12, 15%. I'm so sorry, I can't remember the exact stat, but it was like wild projections about how much electricity use the internet was going to take up, and they did not come true. And I think that we don't really need to worry too much about our digital footprints. I'd say if you're worried about it, then spend more time researching organizations that can do good in the world, or communicating to your friends on social media about why climate change is a problem. But ultimately, solving this problem is about changing massive institutions through political means. And if we're worrying ourselves about our digital footprints, then we're missing the problem.
This is from Adam. How can the virtues of 24/7 carbon-free energy purchasing be best messaged to other off-taker groups, such as smaller corporations or governments? And just to define terms here, the notion of 24/7 carbon-free energy, which is what Google is aiming to achieve by 2030, is sourcing clean energy every hour of the day, every day of the year, everywhere a company operates.
Well, first of all, that it's possible. I mean, I think the fact that a company of Google's size establishing this target, saying we think it can be done in this amount of time, or we're going to be pushing as hard as we can to get it done, is just an indication that everyone can and should be moving as fast as possible. I think underlying Google's belief that this can happen is just how ludicrously cheap renewable energy is becoming, and how much better storage technologies are becoming. And we can use those with sophisticated procurement. Like, any company in the world can buy and power themselves with renewable energy. So if Google can undertake such a monumental task, it's totally possible for other companies to start thinking about powering most of, if not all, of their operations with renewables. I think it also just goes back to this idea that these decisions are not made in energy procurement teams. They're not made by just a chief sustainability officer who has her or his, you know, set of requirements, and they're not really passing those on to other people. That it's like a very extensive top-down set of decisions that have to work their way through companies. And so communicating how integral this needs to be to to all of a company's operations is really important.
Next up from Paulina. So going green is trendy now in corporate commercials, etc. How can a person tell if a corporation is just virtue signaling versus actually trying to make a difference? And how do we keep corporations accountable?
Well, look, the vast majority are virtue signaling. So I think that there are a handful of companies that have gone to extraordinary lengths, and then there's a bunch of companies that are buying a ton of renewable energy and are doing a lot. And there's a bunch of companies that are just, planting trees or buying carbon offsets. And it can be very difficult to distinguish between those three groups. But I think that if you see companies saying, like, we've offset all our carbon, and that's their pitch, or this packaging is 100% green, there's generally the kind of a fluffy language that people use. And look, this conversation is like not an ad for Google, but one of the things that Google has done is, like, say the things that we have done to track sustainability in the past are not going to work anymore, and we need to go this extra mile. And they're establishing, like, very clear, hard language around how you get there, and are talking publicly about that. And that's the difference. The vast majority of companies are really just sort of using these carbon neutral terms. They're talking about offsetting their emissions through planting trees. Generally, if they're only relying on forestry projects, like, you got a problem. But then there are companies that are like, there's Stripe, there's Microsoft, there are a couple others that are actually saying we're going to invest a lot of money into each ton of carbon sequestered by some of these startups that are like capturing CO2 from the air. And those are really interesting because companies are starting to say, hey, we're not just going to rely on forestry projects. We're actually going to pay a lot of money to test out these new technologies to potentially sequester a lot more carbon. And unless you're in the weeds, it can be really hard to differentiate. But I hate to say it, the vast majority of stuff that you see on TV or labeled on packaging is there's a lot of greenwashing involved. So I don't have a definitive answer. I would say if you are interacting with companies on social media, for example, and you see them making these claims, just asking questions about like how they're measuring their targets, or what does it actually mean, and clarifying language. It's a murky world still.
Thanks, Stephen. Yeah, those were some great questions. I have one more, and then we'll wrap up. Can you leave us with one podcast recommendation? Does not need to be related to climate or energy, and then one non-podcast piece of content out there that we can all enjoy that will make us smarter observers when it comes to climate and energy.
Oh my gosh, I have to distill this down to one podcast. Okay.
In 2 minutes.
All right, then I will go with The Experiment, which is a new podcast from The Atlantic and WNYC. They bill it as a show about our unfinished country, and they're taking commonly held perceptions about the United States and flipping them on their head and telling really good stories about the founding of this country, the changes that are happening right now in this country, some of which are challenging our ideas about what we think America is or has historically been. And it is just so rich and beautiful and thought-provoking. I highly recommend it. So that is called The Experiment.
Great.
And because you put me on the spot here to find some non-podcasting content, I will say that I have been extremely impressed with the way the New York Times and the Washington Post have stepped up and invested in climate teams, and they have brought together some of the best journalists in this country to tell the story of climate change in new and interesting ways. And so I would highly, I just want to give them a shout out. But there's also some other publications that people can, if they're really interested in this subject, they can continue to follow. And one is Inside Climate News, which is a nonprofit journalism organization that digs into the corporate power structures, political power structures, and clean energy investment trends that are guiding how we solve climate change and how the energy system is evolving. It's really, really good. And they're doing some excellent investigative journalism. And then I love ProPublica as well. So I think ProPublica has been at the forefront of climate change and environmental investigative journalism. And if you're looking for some non-podcast content, those are publications to read.
Fantastic. Well, thanks for joining Talks at Google, for being a mover and shaker in the podcast world, and for educating and engaging the public about these really important issues of our time.
Thanks, Barry.
Okay. Thanks, Stephen.